Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever part of the world you are joining us from. A warm welcome to this event, the webinar Research to Innovations, Solutions to the Climate Crisis in Africa. My name is Adriaan van Klinken. I'm a professor at the University of Leeds and I will be chairing this event today. Today's event is part of a series of activities hosted by the University of Leeds this week under the theme Connecting Voices for Climate Action. Climate change presents an exceptional global challenge that demands an unparalleled global response. As the UK prepares to host the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference in November this year, the University of Leeds is convening a week of events, gathering voices from across the sectors and geographies to build ambition for impactful action, addressing climate change and environmental challenges. The University of Leeds is one of the UK's leading institutions for interdisciplinary climate-related research, with world-leading expertise cutting across climate and weather modelling, climate risk and sustainable development, low-carbon transitions, and the cultural, social, political and economic dimensions of environmental and climate change. The university's research in this area has a strong focus on Africa. There is a variety of projects and programs that seek to provide solutions to pressing climate change issues on the continent, moving beyond research to innovation that impacts the lives of millions at risk of climate change. Importantly, this research is not only focused on Africa and takes place in African contexts, but also is invested in building genuine collaborative partnerships with academics, researchers, institutions and communities on the continent. Only by working together and by building strong networks, we can make a difference in addressing the challenges our world is facing today. This commitment to partnerships is particularly important in relation to the current climate crisis. After all, this crisis is mostly caused by modern developments such as industrialization in the West, while the effects are particularly felt in Africa and other parts of the global South. Africa is indeed at the center of the global climate crisis, but it is also at the heart of possible solutions. Innovative Africa-centered knowledges are critical to addressing the challenges of our time. Such Africa-centered knowledges combine the latest scientific and technological insights with a deep understanding of African social realities, cultural traditions, and the indigenous knowledges embedded in these. I am reminded here of an anecdote shared by the late Wangari Maathai, the legendary Kenyan environmental activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner. At several occasions, Maathai has shared the following story from her childhood. Growing up in rural Kenya, when she went collecting firewood, her mother warned her not to pick firewood from the wild fig tree. The reason her mom told her was that this tree was the tree of the gods. Only decades later, after studying in the United States, Maathai realized the deep ecological reasoning behind this indigenous belief in the sacred fig tree. She writes, the deep root systems of this tree prevented landslides and allowed rainwater to travel from underground reservoirs to the surface in the streams bursting through the soil. Respecting this tree and not using it for firewood was essential for preventing soil erosion and for water conservation. This realization inspired Maathai to launch the Greenbelt movement, which since the 1970s has planted millions and millions of trees in Kenya alone. I am narrating this story here today, not just because it appeals to my own academic interests, which is at the intersections of religion and African studies, although it is a fascinating anecdote for that. I am sharing it today because the story illustrates that as much as we need the latest scientific findings, we also need to value the long-standing knowledges of local communities and engage with the deep wisdom they contain for addressing the environmental challenges of our times. We need academics and activists, critical theoretical understanding, and concrete strategies for change. Natural sciences and engineering, as well as social sciences, arts and humanities. Universities and grassroots organizations. Collaborations across institutions, nations and continents. Only when we join hands together and transcend the boundaries that too often separate the work many of us are doing, we can effectively face and address the challenges we are facing today. The overall goal of this webinar is to empower all these different stakeholders to effectively contribute to the COP26 conference and to climate action at large. In today's event, we will showcase best practice examples of action research, which benefits local communities and societies. We will catalyze new partnerships and strengthen existing collaborations to support African countries and continental efforts to undertake ambitious climate action. And we will inform African COP26 delegates of opportunities that user-oriented innovation can provide to address key climate change challenges on the continent. The program for the event today is very diverse. We have introductory remarks, we have a keynote speaker, we have a panel discussion, we have closing remarks with a wide range of contributors from different sectors and backgrounds. At this point, I would like to invite His Excellency Seyni Nafo, the Ambassador of the Republic of Mali and High Representative of Climate Change, to deliver his opening remarks and to reflect on the African priorities for COP26.
Thank you, Adrian. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I take the floor here as the spokesperson for the African group. For colleagues, Africa do engages in those negotiations as one, the 54 African countries, and this is peculiar to climate change. Not only is there one group of experts and negotiators, there's also a ministerial level and the heads of state. There's a committee of African heads of state on climate change. So this is probably the single one issue which is being dealt with at technical, political, even heads of state level. So it is from that very standpoint that I take the floor. I've been the spokesperson for the group for the last 10 years or so, and it's a good time to reflect. My opening remarks are going to be around two main issues. The first is fundamental parameters around climate change on the continent, and then I'll really answer the question, which is Africa's priorities for COP26. So a few points for a few foundational elements. The first is that Africa as a continent is way disproportionately impacted by the impacts. The continent only emits 3.84% of GHG emission, but suffers probably the most. In terms of GDP loss, we're talking anywhere from 5 to 9% of GDP loss. It's also in terms of cost, almost 10% of the GDP in some countries, because most of the economies on the continent are based on natural resource management or natural resources. So there's a significant impact there, for instance, in the agriculture sector and elsewhere. COVID has made things a lot worse. Loss of income, not as much in terms of the public health issue. So far, Africa has been relatively isolated from the human loss we've seen elsewhere, but the economic loss is severe, and it's severe because again, the levers that you would have in Europe and in Asia and the US, meaning, you know, the monetary policies and all the stimulus that you can get, this is not something you can revert to in an African context. So COVID has made the situation a lot more severe, and it has also impacted the negotiation. We're going into virtual negotiation, which poses a number of challenge, one of which is just access to electricity, let alone access to the internet. So in case if my internet is down, just be aware that, you know, we might have some you know, this is part of the challenge. But also, well, some challenge as of course the not so interesting side, but we also have some opportunities, and one of which is the US return in the Paris Agreement. Definitely, this is positive. There's going to be a US summit on climate change, I think on Thursday. 5 African heads of state have been invited out of 4, and we're working very hard with our heads of states to sort of lay down some of the priorities I'm going to outline here. And the final foundational element is that African countries, all the 54 African countries, are working very hard now to update. You know, we have a lot of acronyms in climate change. Their national determined contribution, i.e., their climate plans and their climate strategies for the next few years. 3 key now priorities specifically for COP26. So we see the negotiation in what is under negotiation per se. So what is, you know, which translate into COP decisions and so forth. We have the financial institutions which are linked to this negotiation, which support implementation, and then we have implementation on the ground. And this is new. This is new for the group. I mean, 5 to 10 years ago, we would, as a group, solely focus on negotiation per se, as we understand it at COP. But now our mandate has been broadened, and we look into implementation issues. So 3 points. I'll try to be brief to give about 3 points for each of those elements. Negotiation per se, we've been, one of the key outcomes for Glasgow is to finalize the new carbon markets regime. And this is quite, this has a lot of bearing for the system, because you're finding yourself now in a world basically where credits could go from developed to developing countries, from developed countries within themselves. So it's very important to have integrity in the system that you build, more than anything else, to have integrity and to have rules which really ensure that you have environmental integrity. So that's one element. The second element is around finance. After the 100 billion, there's a new negotiation which needs to start for a new finance goal. We'll start that negotiation in Glasgow, as well as getting some clarity and transparency on the finance which has already been provided. The second cluster of issues is around financial institutions, the Green Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund. So that's a negotiation which doesn't happen per se in Glasgow, but happens on the way to Glasgow, and there will be decisions referring to that. Finance is key for implementation, and some of our key ask there is, for instance, for the US to make good on its pledge. The US a few years ago pledged $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund. Only $1 billion was disbursed. There's still $2 billion to go, and we have some decisions at the which I think would I mean, some strategic decision around how do you ensure that more domestic institutions have access to finance, and how do you support them in the mobilization of that. The third cluster is implementation on the ground, and I think there you have 3 points. First one on collaboration and partnership. African countries, I mean, African heads of states over the last 2 to 3 years have created 6 flagship initiatives on the ground, 3 thematic, 3 regional. And the regions are the Sahel, the Congo Basin, and the islands. And the themes are renewable energy, adaptation, and adaptation of the African agriculture. Those initiatives are vehicles to ensure that we have enhanced action on the ground. And this is an area for, again, for collaboration and partnership. Capacity is going to be key. Capacity to formulate the programs and implement the programs, capacity to mobilize resources for finance, and capacity for implementation. Last but not least, research and innovation, which I think is at the heart of what we'll be talking about here. This is key, and I personally see at least 3 areas, and I'm happy. I receive a lot of invitation, but I wanted to come. I see some of the work you're doing at the university, so there's 3 areas which are key for us: digital economy, or the 4th industrial revolution. Anything from telecoms to Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, big data. And it's important, it's relevant in each of the sectors: for hydromet, for food security, for water and urban planning, for infrastructure. This is extremely important. Zero carbon hydrogen. We're extremely interested in the potential of zero carbon hydrogen and green ammonia. So not just for energy, but for industry, for agriculture. Africa has a big potential there, and financial innovation. So there's really an opportunity there to have a systemic approach and ensure that research and innovation is really translated from science to policy to action on the ground. So I really wanted to finish with that, because that to some of us is key. We've seen how Africa, in, for instance, the telecom industry, we have leapfrog from basically no access to telephone, to cell phone, and now digital payments and all those services. We have a keen interest in replicating that and expanding that across innovation, across sectors beyond food, as I've mentioned, beyond food, which is key. It's 40%. Most African countries have about 40% of their economy depending on the agriculture sector. But agriculture is important. Water, energy, having an integrated approach. I've been really long, but thanks. This is a topic I have a very keen interest, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nafo, for these very insightful introductory remarks. I am glad that your internet connection, at least this afternoon, is stable, but thanks for reminding us that we can't take that for granted, and it's one of the very kind of concrete challenges of negotiating about those kind of issues in the current COVID crisis. Also, thank you for helping us to set our research and innovation agenda, which is very important. And I hear you when you underline the need for science to be combined with policy and with action. And I think that some of the following contributions in this event today will actually help to further unpack how these 3 cornerstones can be connected, can be interlinked in the work that many of us are doing. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Barbara Evans, who holds the chair in Public Health Engineering in the School of Engineering at the University of Leeds. In her keynote address, she will share with us from her rich experience and expertise in leading multidisciplinary research on climate change-related issues in the Global South. Barbara, it's my pleasure to be welcoming you today and to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you very much to Ambassador Saini and to the conveners for giving me this opportunity to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart. Oh, sorry, just getting control of my screen. I've been asked to talk about the role of research in tackling the climate crisis, and when I started to think about this, I was reminded of this proverb which I lifted from Chigozie Obiama's wonderful book, The Fisherman. In the book, misunderstanding and misplaced competition between siblings leads to a tragedy. And the climate crisis calls for extraordinary transformations in society, in politics, and in personal behaviour. So we can ill afford the same kind of misunderstanding and further tragedy. The very complexity of achieving a change in behaviour at multiple levels is precisely why collaborative research is needed now more than ever before. And we've just heard the very sort of impassioned articulation of that from the ambassador. So we need to understand how to change behaviours. The science of human behaviour is itself a massive field, and I could have dedicated my 10 minutes to discussion about that. But for now, I hope you'll humour me when I state that in general, we can understand human behaviour as a function of the behaviour setting of environmental pressures acting on the human brain and body. Oh, I haven't started my timer. And this holds true at all scales, from the individual to the collective, and whether we're thinking about small-scale farmers or large, in every sense of the word, scale presidents or prime ministers and even governments. For ease, here I'm using a framing from my own field, public health, and the work of Robert Unger and Val Curtis to illustrate the point. If we're going to solve the climate crisis, we're going to have to think of radical ways to intervene to change the state of the world. And it's plausible to argue that all of those interventions have to be mediated through the behaviour setting in order to achieve the desired impact. Unger and Curtis, amongst others, have argued for a cyclical or iterative process by which we can design, implement and evaluate interventions which act on the behaviour setting, either on the environment or on individual or collective incentives, and influence behaviour. They describe a sequence of 5 steps required to design an intervention to change specific behaviours: assess and build theories of change, create an intervention, deliver it and evaluate it. And I'll use these to explore the role that research can play. We'll start at the beginning, and the place where perhaps the link between research and the climate crisis is most evident to the world at large: the assessment and building of theories of change. The role of research in an assessment of potential responses to the climate crisis is relatively easy to justify and explain. For a start, research provides us with increasingly detailed and confident information on the scale, speed, and direction of climate change. At Leeds, with numerous partners across Africa, we've been active participants in several large-scale collaborative research efforts, including Future Climate for Africa, Africa Swift, and AfriCap. These large-scale collaborations allow African climate scientists to gain a platform for the critical new science and new insights that are emerging as modelling and observational capabilities increase. I've picked out 2 examples of recent papers here, but honestly, I could have talked to you all day about the findings from these incredible research programmes. But it's not all about climate science. Here's an example of some work that looks at the emotional impacts of climate change on pastoral communities in the Afar region in Ethiopia. This type of assessment research is fundamental, because if we don't understand the motivations and drivers of current behaviour, we will never be able to tailor interventions to change them. If we're to understand community behaviours, we need to be very aware of cultural drivers and develop inductive research methods. And at the intersection between assessment and building theories of change, our research needs to increasingly connect climate science to more pragmatic or applied sectoral information, as we've just heard. Here's an example from Marian Amoa Kowayosei and colleagues from the Africa Swift team who've been working in the Pra Basin in Ghana, exploring how possible climate futures would impact on water resources and water quality. In Africa, particularly, the complex interplay of climate and water is going to dominate much planning and policy making for years to come. And there are links here to sustainable energy, to big data, and to the low carbon future. Here's another example from Rory Fitzpatrick and his colleagues who spent time translating climate science into terms that colleagues in agriculture and health could respond to in West Africa by describing the impacts of climate change on a typical day in the future. This work was partially funded by 6 international research collaborations and shows the value of pooling collective knowledge across sectoral boundaries and linking high-level research to impacts on the ground and policymakers. There are other really exciting developments, of course, and new tools arriving all the time, which aim to support the building of theories of change and interventions. But these themselves need to be evaluated and reviewed. Paul Cook and colleagues, for example, have built up significant experience of using participatory video to support development, but they're also working collaboratively with their partners on the ground, here, for example, in South Africa, to assess the extent to which these tools give the outcomes they're expected to give, and in particular, to question if they really give voice to vulnerable or excluded groups who are often systematically ignored. In a similar way, the High Crystal team developed a backcasting planning tool that helps to link longer-term climate change to short-run policy making, and they've been continuously engaged with their many partners in the Lake Victoria Basin to assess whether this supports more climate-sensitive planning or not. Sometimes, the creation of an intervention requires sparse data, complex science, and local knowledge to be combined. The resulting new synthesized methods and these themselves need to be supported with analysis and validation. The Umfula project linked climate science and interventions through collaborative, multi-stakeholder modelling to understand how the climate was impacting on water levels in Lake Malawi. Over time, follow-up and further research can embed and improve the accuracy of such collaborative data generation. In some cases, this can go even further. The team from African Swift are piloting a new approach that links short-term forecasts or nowcasting to health planning, allowing health workers to mobilise in districts where meningitis outbreaks are likely to occur. When it comes to delivery, and particularly to implementation science, there is an urgent, pressing need for scaling up of the level of research contributing to our understanding of how policy and implementation can translate into real changes in behaviour. One point to make here, which has already been said several times, is that research that has the potential to impact on Africa does not have to be research about Africa. A point I haven't yet made, but we all know, is that the most critical and most stubbornly difficult changes in behaviour are needed in rich nations, not in poorer ones. 3 centres, all with a connection to Leeds, for example, are engaged with UK energy policy and its implementation. Back in Africa, there's extensive work also on delivery. At Leeds, we're working with colleagues in East Africa to update and increase the accuracy of our estimates for the emission of greenhouse gases from sanitation, and this has relevance to the NDCs, which are being prepared now. Funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and working with Kyambogo University in Uganda and Haramaya in Ethiopia, this project's developing a new framework for assessing the greenhouse gas profiles of different sanitation services and proposing thereby new climate-smart sanitation investments. And when it comes to evaluation, perhaps here we can most easily perceive the critical role of research to generate lessons and to improve our implementation strategies. Here's an example of a study from a group led by Anna Medee, who used political economy analysis to assess the extent to which so-called climate-smart agricultural policies are changing the lived experiences for farmers in this particular region. And I could have picked out many examples here. This has been a bit of a rushed whistle-stop tour because there's so much to say. When I started putting this talk together, I was puzzled as to the motivation. To me, I'm someone who's had a career both in the so-called real world of engineering and also at the World Bank and in academia. It seems obvious that we need to continuously be generating new knowledge, new synthesis, and new ideas to tackle the climate crisis. But as I said at the start, it's easy to see how research can be criticised as something that sits in an ivory tower, divorced from reality. I think this argument can be challenged if we're clear that climate change requires fundamental and massive shifts in human behaviour at all levels, and that this in turn requires us both to understand more about what drives those behaviours and what interventions are likely to create change. To understand the enormity of this challenge, it may help to recall that it took 50 years from when the direct, unequivocal link between smoking and lung cancer was established until any government started to impose bans on smoking in public places. And in many places, that battle is yet to be won. That was a battle that was hampered by the vested interests of the tobacco lobby. And even more powerful and diverse vested interests are against us in the climate change battles ahead. I believe passionately that research has a role to play at every step of the way, but the problem is complex and challenging, and we cannot, should not expect it to be a simple linear journey. We need to embrace risk-taking and encourage thorough, rigorous evaluation every time we take those risks. We have to move beyond the idea of the isolated, brilliant professor, the quick fix, the genius solution. The research that we need today is collaborative, transcends disciplinary boundaries, and must forefront the voices of the most badly affected people who are least responsible for the crisis. I leave you with some words from the Professor of Poetry at Leeds, Simon Armitage, who, amongst other things, reminds me to say that we will also need creative and artistic genius quite as much as science to see us through. Thank you. Back to you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for presenting such a rich showcase of the diversity of relevant research in this area taking place, not just at the University of Leeds, but across the world, in the networks, in the partnerships that we are involved in. And the 5 letters that you pointed out, the A of assess, the B of building, C of creating, the D of delivery, and the E of evaluation are really insightful to kind of point out the different steps and the different levels at which action needs to be taken in order to bring about behavioral change at the level of individual behavior, at the level of communities, at the level of political decision making, and at the global level. So this is really insightful, and thank you for doing such a fabulous job in 10 minutes time to really summarize the diversity of the research taking place in this area. And for anyone who is interested, please do follow up some of the references that Barbara made to publications that have come out of this research that you can find online. So next, as part of our program this afternoon, we will move to a panel discussion with voices from key stakeholders. And I believe that the different stakeholders participating in the panel discussion will help to bring across the point that Barbara made in her talk just now, that it is important to avoid a situation where academic research, scientific research, remains in the ivory tower of academia, and the importance of translating it and implementing it at different levels will be made clear by the contributions from the panelists in our discussion today. So in our panel discussion, we have 4 panelists whom I will introduce in a minute. But just before I introduce them, one question to everyone in the audience. If you have questions to members of the panel, please post them in the Q&A section on the right-hand side. After the panel discussion or after the first round of responses from the panelists, we will open up for a Q&A of about 20 minutes time. And I see that the first questions are already coming in. So please do post your questions, and we try to include and incorporate as many of them as possible in the discussion. So the 4 panelists are the following people who in their different areas of work have made and are making a tremendous contribution to impactful research and policy work in the area of climate change. The first panelist is Robert Zouk-Moret, who is the Africa Program Leader of the Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, who will be speaking from a research perspective. The second panelist is Rosalind West, who is the Climate Science Team Lead at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who will be presenting from a funder's perspective. The third panelist is Thembi Makamamba, Director of Policy Research and Analysis at the Food, Agricultural and Natural Resources Policy and Analysis Network, who will be speaking from a policy perspective. Last but not least, the fourth panelist is Doug Parker, Met Office Professor of Meteorology at the University of Leeds, who will be speaking from his research experience. So I will ask a couple of questions to start the conversation, after which we will take questions from people in the audience. Robert, I would like to begin with you. From your perspective, leading Africa-wide efforts, what do researchers need to do differently to achieve greater impact?
Thank you, Adrian. Hello to everyone. Very happy to be here. We've heard what came as major areas of research that needs to be taken further through the presentation of Barbara, but also the introduction of Ambassador Nafo. And I just want to highlight that, for instance, the sustainable finance area is something that seems to be new. It's an emerging area for research, and we researchers, we need to really take into account what are the emerging areas that the different users need. And for that, I think researchers need to really change the way we are conducting our research in such a way that at the end of the day, the innovation that will come out from this research can be tailored, to the needs of the users. And I think Ambassador Nafo mentioned it clearly. So among others, and just based on what CCAFS as a program has been doing during the last 10 years, there are some lessons learned from our action research. I just want to highlight one or two of them. For instance, we realize that it is important that researchers listen and value the users through the prioritization and their context, because sometimes the results need to be contextualized to the context, and not taking that into account can lead to not being able to scale. And the second thing we realize is that farmers should be, for instance, in the agricultural sector, be seen as key partners of our research, because researchers can learn a lot from the long-standing experiences of these people in order to develop innovative nature-based solutions. And finally, another example I can give is that we really need, as researchers, to develop scientific knowledge on approaches and tools that can really capacitate both the researchers, especially the national agricultural research institutions, to be able to conduct the research first, and then to generate the knowledge that the different next users, extensionists, policymakers, farmers can effectively use to mainstream and scale up the different technologies and innovation that they have developed. So basically, these are some of the areas we believe research should also innovate to help move the agenda of climate action. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Robert, for making this key point, underlining the importance of listening to the stakeholders, to local communities, and particularly to farmers, and to engage with the knowledge that they present from their work and experience. Rosalind, would you like to follow up on that? We have heard from Robert on the changes that are needed among researchers. How can funders support these changes? And what will the Adaptation Research Alliance do to accelerate action research?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it really kind of follows on exactly the same lines. I think that research funders are in a really strong position to support these changes, to enable and to incentivize really impactful research by exactly the same way that Robert has suggested, by really taking the time to listen, to consult widely amongst the users and people who will be able to implement this research in action, and to understand the most pressing knowledge needs, the research and innovation gaps, and use those to set our research agendas. We really need to be asking when we're doing that, what do the most vulnerable people, communities, businesses, governments really need to know in order to be able to make evidence-based decisions on how to survive and indeed thrive under climate change? And I think that funders really need to use this understanding and to prioritise the research that they choose to fund in consultation with those users, and should also liaise really closely with other funders to ensure that we're taking a coordinated approach and covering the space in a really systematic fashion. I think funders can also really help by thinking carefully about the criteria by which research proposals are assessed. For instance, by using a broader definition of research excellence that incorporates the societal impact of that research. Also through the way that funding is structured, for instance, using seed grants to enable people to build new networks and work in new ways, collaborate on new and innovative partnerships. and also using the requirements or conditions that they're attached to the funding in order to incentivize transdisciplinary approaches and to emphasize learning, co-production, capacity building, and networking. For adaptation and resilience in particular, we really need now to go beyond the status quo to enable transformational change that's commensurate with the increasing scale of the challenge. And for that, I think we need a much sharper focus on action-orientated, user-centered research. And we think that funders really need to invest in transdisciplinary approaches to do that. As part of the UK's COP26 presidency's Adaptation and Resilience campaign, we are co-developing an international adaptation research alliance for launch at the COP, which will do exactly this and bring organisations across the research and action spectrum together in this way. So 33 organisations have already committed to co-developing this alliance with the aim of catalysing increased investment and capacity for action-orientated research and innovation, primarily in developing countries, at the scale and the urgency that's demanded by the science. And we're hoping that many more will join us by the time of the COP in November. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara, for bringing in this funder's perspective and for echoing Robert's comments on the importance of listening to the different stakeholders and collaboratively developing and setting a research agenda that makes a difference at a grassroots level in local communities and societies. I would like to follow up with Tammy. Your work is with policymakers on the continent, and we have heard about the increasing focus on action research from Robert and Rosalind. What more do policymakers need from researchers in your experience?
Thanks, Adrian, for that question. Sorry, I think I'm getting... Hello?
We can hear you, but there seems to be background noise.
Hello? Is this better?
Yeah, this is much
Can you hear me? Oh, apologies. Not sure where the interference is coming from. Listening to Robert and to Rosalind, I really believe that science has an important role to play in especially focusing the climate debate and guiding policymakers in ways that are transformative. I think the things that Ambassador Nafo mentioned are really specific of what the negotiators want to see. And there's an opportunity for science to come in specifically to respond to those sort of priorities that have been set by the policymakers. But for that to happen, there is a real need for a partnership between science and policy at multiple levels and at many different scales. I think it is only through a real two-way communication and relationship building that effective partnerships can be built. And if you allow me just to give an example of how we are trying to do this as FANAPAN through the partnership that we have with the University of Leeds, Chatham House, the University of Aberdeen, and the UK Met Office through the Africa program that we are implementing in Malawi, Tanzania, South Africa, and Zambia. The program is providing integrated evidence for policy pathways. It brings together state-of-the-art crop, climate modeling with trade, nutrition analysis, and it brings together expert knowledge and stakeholder and different stakeholders from these countries. What we have done is we have actually set up task forces composed of different range of individuals with expertise right across the different areas where we're working: climate smart agriculture, nutrition security, agriculture, and food security policy. And these task forces have really been designed to guide the researchers in terms of the modeling work that they are doing in sort of projecting future scenarios, so as to make them relevant as possible for each country, and so that they inform policy. So the idea is that the research agenda needs to be developed in partnership with policymakers, and the policymakers need to be part of the process every step of the way. So what we are learning is that researchers need to be as clear as possible in presenting their research evidence. Don't complicate things, right? Put it in layman's terms, put it in a language that someone that didn't go to school to study science can understand. It's also important to situate the evidence. I think oftentimes researchers have their own research agenda, they've got their own timelines. But what is important is it needs to be relevant to current events. What is going on in the country right now? What is the government focusing on? Can your research speak to that? I know that research timelines can be longer, but remember, politician timelines are often 4 to 5 years. So can you inform somebody that has got such a short timeline to sort of make the right decisions? So for me, I believe that it is important that we really situate the research on current events, make it relevant, and you can only do that by being in conversation with the people that are making the policies, and making sure that you are constantly receiving their feedback, even on your research, on what you're doing, that it's relevant to sort of the decisions that they're trying to take at the time. I think for me, for now, maybe let me leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for these very insightful remarks on the importance for scientific researchers to work in partnerships with policymakers at a grassroots level, and for underlining the need to speak layman's language, to be accessible, and to keep relevance, including political relevance, in mind when we develop our research plans. I'd like to move on to Doug. From your perspective as a research leader, what have you learned from tapping into opportunities for commercialization, and what challenges do you face in this area?
Yes, we've just started, in fact, trying to explore commercialization of weather forecasting products. And it seems to me that there should be much more commercial delivery of climate information in Africa, because the potential economic benefits are tremendous. A lot of economic sectors are sensitive to the climatic conditions, but actually it's more limited than you might expect, and that's a kind of puzzle at the moment. I suspect that a large part of this is in fact because the skill of the underlying weather forecast remains quite low for Africa, and this is, I think, something that a lot of people are not so aware of. I think it's quite hard to get people to part with their money to pay for something if they don't have confidence somehow in what they're paying for. On the other hand, we know that there are firms, there are private companies moving in to make a profit from climate information in Africa. Typically, they are organizations from outside Africa, from the global north, which are commercializing forecasts. And typically, I think they're doing that by moving into the cutting edge, the research cutting edge, particularly in high resolution forecast modeling. Alongside this advance in commercialization, I think there are some real ethical challenges which we face as a community. I think these solutions, which are typically from outside Africa, are arguably getting forecast information to vulnerable people who need it. So they're improving the flow of information to the people who need that information. And they're doing that in a way which I think we as a research community or the national agencies or the funding bodies, the development agencies, have been failing to do. I think the commercial interests have been perhaps succeeding where we have not succeeded. But equally, there are a number of serious risks around this. And typically, as I've inferred, these solutions are often coming from outside Africa, and effectively profits are being taken from Africa outside. And typically they're failing to invest in the infrastructure on which those very forecasts are built, and particularly, say, the observational networks in Africa. So in order to make a weather forecast, you need good observations, and those are being provided by the African infrastructure. And yet the profits from a commercial forecast may not be reinvested into those networks. So the African forecast agencies quite rightly feel somewhat threatened, I think, by commercialization, and they feel that they're not well positioned to compete with companies from the global north who maybe have greater technological capacity available to them and greater finance, and the African agencies can't so well compete. And another important risk, I think, of commercialization is quality control. So when the only motivation is commercial profit for an agency, then there isn't necessarily a motivation to maintain the quality of the information. And that information can be life-saving. So it can be a matter of life and death, and there's a profit motive driving that. So at the moment, there's no systematic evaluation happening for forecasts in Africa. Well, sorry, I shouldn't generalize, but in tropical Africa in particular. So we really don't know what the quality of, in general, the quality of forecasts from commercial providers are. And particularly the ordinary people who may be paying for these forecasts don't know. And they may be buying bad medicine, as I like to call it. They may be paying for something which is actually unhealthy. So in our own efforts to commercialize short-range weather forecasts that we're initiating in Leeds, we've started with an ethical constitution to our setup in the same way as an NGO might have. So to make sure that we work through the mandated local agencies wherever possible, and we make sure that we reinvest in the basic infrastructure which is supporting what we do. So in the end, I think commercialization is coming, and I believe it will probably bring better information to ordinary people, and it will lead to better outcomes. But we really have to be vigilant that that's not at the cost of undermining African skills and infrastructure, and we have to be vigilant that people are not paying for low quality information and aren't well informed about what they're paying for.
Thank you, Doug, for these very insightful comments, highlighting both the opportunities that come with commercialization, but also drawing attention to the critical and ethical challenges and the risks that are involved. We have got a couple of minutes left for this round of discussion. So I'd like to ask follow-up questions to each of the panelists and invite you for a very brief response, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. Robert, may I invite you to very briefly speak about what you think that COP26 can do in terms of translating research and policy to addressing the challenges that we are facing?
Yeah, I think things are becoming very clear that engagement with key partners is really the key things to really making research output credible, relevant, and able to trigger outreach to reach outcomes and scaling. And I can just give one quick example. For instance, in Ghana, we've tried to develop a public-private partnership in order to disseminate climate information services, the kind of information, the forecast that Doug just mentioned. And it happens that through this partnership, we were able to put together in a partnership public institutions, but also private entities that work together in a business model to be able to disseminate this information to reach more than 300,000 farmers in northern Ghana. I think these are the kind of experiences in terms of innovation and lessons learned that we need to take further for climate action to take place as in line with the COP26. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Rosalind, may I invite you to briefly talk about what FCDO plans to do at COP26 in terms of transforming research to innovation?
I'll try to be brief, but this is such a big focus of what we're doing that I've got quite a lot to say, but I'll try and be very brief. So, throughout this UK presidency of COP26, we're really emphasising the power of research and innovation to turn this increased ambition that we're seeing everywhere really into effective action that can help us adapt and build resilience, reduce emissions, and to strengthen our collaboration and particularly support for developing countries. And to do that, we're advocating for a real shift in how we invest in research and innovation. We wanted to focus on the greatest global challenges, to involve stakeholders from the outset, to really focus, as Robert was saying, on deployment and scaling and linking that finance through to move technologies from early stage research all the way through to deployment in the field in that end-to-end approach. And if I just then, from my long list, focus on just two examples. So within the COP26 Nature campaign, we're leading efforts efforts to transform agricultural innovation for people, nature and climate. And this initiative is seeking to foster a step change in the scale and the pace of agricultural innovation to enable our future demands for food to be met. To sustainably defeat hunger and to produce enough nutritious food under an ongoing climate change. And for that, we need innovations that take scale into account from the beginning, and innovation in delivery and incentives to reach scale. And then those themes are also, key to our COP26 adaptation and resilience campaign, which are being advanced by the Adaptation Research Alliance, which is focusing on, targeted advocacy, creative cooperation, and also scaled resource delivery. That's really aiming to ensure that the most pressing needs for adaptation and resilience actions are effectively addressed. We believe that this Adaptation Research Alliance really has the potential to lead a transformation in how adaptation research is conducted, linking knowledge all the way through to action and delivering those innovative, practical solutions. And we really hope that many other organisations will be able to commit to joining this alliance in time for its launch at COP26 and long beyond. So I hope that wasn't too long. Thanks.
You did a fabulous job, Rosalind. Thank you so much for summarizing the enormous amount of work that you were doing in this area in just 1 or 2 minutes. Tammy, from the conversation and the discussion so far, there is a long list of priorities emerging. Could you briefly speak to the political economy aspects relating to the implementation of these priorities for climate change?
Okay. That's a big one, political economy. But I think for me is that a lot of sort of policy ideas or recommendations that may emerge from research, they often seem good on paper, but they often fail in their actual implementation. And I think there's probably a long running joke in how Africa has got excellent policies, but where it fails is on implementation. So I think the implementation process often has a life of its own. Policymakers work within a contested space, especially, say, the agriculture ministers, the sort of environment people. They have to go up against education, they have to go up against health, they have to go up against, all sorts of other sort of competing needs and priorities for the country. So how do they make it work within that space? For me, I think it's really about developing policy options that are robust, that don't just focus on one sector, but have sort of core benefits for other sectors. And it's also about making sure that whatever sort of research we are doing, the conclusions that we are coming to are very relevant. I mean, I think I spoke about the issue of relevance before, and I want to bring it up again, that they should not just be relevant to agriculture or just relevant to environment, but to the whole development process within the country. Right? Countries have national development plans. And those national development plans, they're not isolating one sector over the other, but they're looking at what needs to happen within the whole country. So it's sort of a really big thing that policymakers from environment and agriculture, where climate change normally sits, struggle with. And I think ultimately, we're not just talking about societal impact of whatever policy options we are presenting, but we are also looking at, is it financially feasible? Ambassador Nafo spoke about the need for finance. Governments are really struggling with really limited budgets, and if we keep throwing at them different options, they grapple where to find the budget to actually implement those options. But it's a good thing that Rosalind here has talked about, the sort of partnerships that funders are coming together to form in order to support governments to do that. And I think that's something that's really, really important. And I think maybe just as a last point on this one, I think researchers also need to be aware that policymakers are not always reading through journal articles to know what's the latest research that's coming out, right? They are not always keeping track of what the new scientific thinking is. And it's important that researchers sort of extend, build bridges to make sure that they are constantly in communication with policymakers and civil society as well. Actually, let's not forget civil society, because civil society is the bridge in often cases between the two sort of big camps. And my organization, Fanapan, does that quite well in terms of building multi-stakeholder platforms to bring together different stakeholders to share the new science that's coming out, but also to hear from policymakers what they need. Yeah.
Thank you, Tammy. It's always a good reminder for scientists that policymakers and people in civil society are not reading our academic papers all the time, but that we need to make that transition to a policy level ourselves. A final question for this round to Doug. From your earlier comments in the panel, it is clear that we are at a revolution in the accuracy and relevance of weather forecasts. From your kind of perspective, how do you see the way forward?
I think I'm probably echoing things that people have already said, and I can keep that brief. But I think there's a number of items of progress that need to be made, and none are optional. They're all necessary, and they involve partnership, and they involve interdisciplinarity, and involves basically juggling a number of factors and keeping them all going at the same time. Ultimately, we need better weather information, so the science needs to improve. It's currently, I would argue, not fit for purpose. But I think we're very close to that point. We need to evaluate. We need to co-produce solutions. We need to build the capability of the African research community and scientific community, including the operational centres, to take ownership of that. So that at the moment there's too much reliance on the global north. But we also need to recognise that it's an international activity, and it always will be. So we should never imagine this is going to be purely African. The global climate enterprise is truly global, and we're all reliant on each other. So I feel that we're close to enormous progress, but it requires a balancing act between a number of aspects of that direction.
Thank you so much for that second comment. I see in the chats that the number of questions is growing, so thank you so much for posting your questions. People watching, people in the audience. We have about 50 minutes and we won't be able to take all questions, but I'll try to combine questions thematically and ask panelists for brief responses. So to begin, and I think these two questions kind of follow up on some of the points that have already been mentioned so far. How is Africa able to enact policy at a regional and at a national level, especially in relation to handling greenhouse gas emissions? So enacting policy, what is the agency, what is the ability of African policymakers, governments, etc., to enact, and to how can that be improved and strengthened? And second, how do we expand access to climate research funds for researchers that are based in African institutions of learning? We have talked a lot about partnerships, about collaboration, but how can those kind of research funds benefit African academic institutions and local researchers in the continent? So any member of the panel who would like to respond to either or both of the questions briefly, please. Robert?
Thanks, Adrian. I just want to comment on the first question on the importance of science policy interfacing, because I think unless there is a sort of synergy between the two components, that we will not succeed to make an effective use of the scientific knowledge to inform policy development, for instance. And I just want to show that in West Africa, for instance, we've tried to put what we call, to put in place what we call the National Science Policy Dialogue platforms, through which we have all the sort of national entities, public entities, working around climate change, development, sustainable development, interacting strongly and regularly with academia, with national agricultural research institutions to take advantage of the evidence-based scientific knowledge that have been generated to capacitate them to inform the national policies, but also to capacitate the negotiators to be able to defend, for instance, how agriculture or food security should be considered during the negotiation on climate. So those are the kind of successful cases I can mention. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Doug, I think I saw your hand as well.
Yes, I was going to respond on the second question,
Please.
which is around how African institutions can engage in research programs, research funding. I think Rosalind West can probably confirm this, but I think the international funding agencies are really desperate to get strong African leadership for their programs. And I think where leadership develops and is generated and is offered, then this will be supported. So the question is how we build sufficient confidence, experience within African institutions to take that kind of leadership. And I think that's where partnership comes in. And that's where building the careers of early career researchers through existing programs, through the programs that we have. And as part of those existing programs, mentoring and encouraging our colleagues in Africa to take leadership roles and to move to that next step of international leadership. And I think we have examples all over our emerging programs, which have been, going on, things like Future Climates for Africa and the GCRF programs, WISER and SHEAR. We have examples of those emerging African leaders. And the next step is really to take them to that next level of building and owning larger scale activities.
Rosalind, would you like to briefly follow up on that? And actually, I see that there is a specific question for you in the chat, which you possibly can take as well. The question is, could you please give more details on the Action Alliance and how people or organizations can sign up to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I would really echo exactly as Doug has said, that we are very keen to support African leadership of research programs, and that through the programs that we have been funding over the years, we have absolutely been doing that and supporting that capacity development. We've had some of our research fellows who've come right the way through from being research fellows now to being IPCC lead authors, and that's just been fantastic to see, and we really want to encourage more of that. And indeed, we have this as a principle of the Adaptation Research Alliance to encourage Southern leadership of research in particular. And I think another example alongside those that Doug has mentioned, is to do with this kind of idea about seed funding that I mentioned earlier, to really give people the opportunity to really extend their networks and to identify new opportunities, but also to demonstrate their capability and to develop that further, and to really generate those partnerships that can then build into much bigger research consortia when putting in proposals for the bigger research calls that are out. And then the second question was about the Adaptation Research Alliance and how to get involved. I think that some information has been put into the chat on that. You can also find us on Twitter as Adapt Alliance. And so we'll put the handle for that in the chat as well. But you're very welcome to get involved. You can also email ara@southsouthnorth.org. So I'll put some of those details in the chat, and we're very keen to hear from you and to get involved. So thank you.
Tammy, would you like to respond to either of the questions that have been asked?
Yes, I wanted to respond to the first question that was on the capacity for policymaking within the African continent. I think there is real capacity, and there are platforms that are designed to sort of bring researchers and scientists together. Robert mentioned what they're doing in West Africa. In Eastern Southern Africa, FANAPAN also has its multi-stakeholder policy dialogue platforms where we try to facilitate those discussions. I think the key thing, though, that we need to realize is that it has to be a facilitated process. It just doesn't happen on its own. So it needs facilitation, and I think that's where probably support needs to go to in making sure that those two groups are brought together. And I mean, we have even initiatives that are led by the regional economic communities as well as national government. Within Southern Africa, we have the SADC thematic working group on climate change and disaster and risk management, which is a platform that brings together different actors to be able to sort of share, exchange ideas on sort of climate change and disaster related issues. And those are some of the platforms that we can use to foster that exchange and communication between science and policymakers. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tammy. I'm going to combine a couple of questions which may seem to represent a kind of wide range of issues, but there may be interesting connections as well. The first one relates to COVID-19, which was mentioned, I think, by Robert at the beginning of his presentation. And the question is, COVID-19 has really brought the spotlight to innovation, not just for vaccine development, but also different ways of working, ICT, etc. How can we bring the same approach to research and innovation for climate change? So some of the urgency, but also some of the innovation that COVID has kind of enabled us to develop. How can we apply? What are the lessons that can be learned? A second question, how can we increase collaboration between academia, companies, and the end users and policymakers in order to accelerate impact? We have been talking a lot about impactful research, translating it from the ivory tower from academia to a grassroots level, etc. But any specific kind of advice that members of the panel are able to give on that would be appreciated. And finally, the different panelists and the speakers in today's session have highlighted the importance of transdisciplinary research. But actually doing that kind of research is not easy. It is difficult, partly because of the boundaries within institutions. So how can we get transdisciplinary research implemented within our own academic institutions and with partner organizations? Doug, please.
Shall I just make a short comment about the first one? So that the question about I think the example of COVID is really interesting for science globally and science that is concerned with humanity. It really demonstrates first, I think, the power of modern science. I think the response to COVID, for all the problems that we've had, has really shown how much power there is behind modern science when we choose to harness it. It also shows how much governments can do and are prepared to do if they're put into that situation. Personally, I think it comes back to this point of immediacy that Tembi made very well. That I think in the climate debate we need to think about these short timescales. We need to remind people that the climate has changed in Africa, and this is not theoretical. It's happening now. It's not a drill, and we need to take actions now. And we have a scientific framework, and we have solutions that we can bring out. And what's needed is to firstly to put energy behind that, but also the whole everything that's been discussed today about the engagement that's required and the human movement or change that is needed to do that.
Thank you so much. Any other panelists? Robert, please.
I just want to comment on the transdisciplinary research perspective. I think, like everyone said in this panel, as soon as the focus and the priority is given to the users, in the case, for instance, of agriculture, a farmer is not just an agriculturalist or a forester or a livestock producer or a fisher producer. He's all of those different thematic areas. So as soon as we decide that the focus should be on the next users, the end users of our results, we should necessarily put together our respective differentiated performance and competencies in research to cover the needs in a more integrated manner. That's the way I think we can build a sort of innovative partnership for the research itself. And of course, funding can come also as another incentive to really oblige the different research institutions to work together around cross-cutting thematic areas, for instance. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Tambi.
Thanks, Adrian. I want to sort of try and respond to the question around the links between different players. I think there was research, policymakers, private sector, and the like. I think for me is we never really make a good case of why we should work together. You know, when you look at private sector is after the bottom line, right? They want to make a profit. So we need to speak to that. We need to speak to how can private sector make the profit but benefit, you know, all these other stakeholders, right? I think policymakers, on the other hand, have to create a conducive environment for private sector to thrive. So, you know, there is something in there within the policy space for private sector as well. Same goes with research. Research is the one that can actually inform these different stakeholders on the different options that can work to bring these different partners together. So we need to sort of, I don't know whether it's creating a value proposition for working with different stakeholders and making sure that we are actually speaking to the core of what each of the stakeholders want to get out of any partnership.
Thank you, Tambi, for making that point very clear. Rosalind, is there anything you would like to add to the questions that have been raised?
Just very briefly on this point about COVID, and you know, this COVID-19 pandemic is compounding the climate-related and other risks, but it's also laying bare the need for far greater levels of resilience to shocks in societies and our systems worldwide, and has also exposed all of us to really thinking about the interdependencies of our systems, our supply chains, you know, and really understanding that as well. And so I think that alongside, you know, harnessing the fact that we're all realizing how important science is for resolving some of the immediate pressures of COVID, and the vaccination advances have been absolutely incredible there. I think it also, you know, it's an opportunity for us in that the challenges of recovery from COVID are also the opportunity to build back in a much more climate resilient way that address these issues of societal resilience to other bigger challenges that might lie on the path ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. And thank you to all of the members of the panel for their insightful comments based on their own experience, their own work in this field of climate action at a research and at a policy level. There are many more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we don't have the time right now to discuss these questions. But some of the panelists might be able to either might be happy to respond to some of the issues that have been raised by email. So if you have posed a question and you are really keen on receiving a response, feel free to email the organizers and we might be able to pass it on to the panelists for a follow-up. At this moment, I would like to close the panel discussion and thank the audience for raising these very insightful and pertinent questions, and thank the panelists for their insightful responses. I would like to invite Sir Nick Kay to deliver closing remarks for this webinar today. Sir Nick Kay is the COP26 Regional Ambassador for Africa, and in his closing remarks, he will share with us his reflections on the journey towards COP26.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for the invitation from the University of Leeds and your impressive organization of this event today. What a great panel. Also, I can see online what an expert audience you have across Africa and more widely as well. So you all know that climate change is important, and you all know that Africa is important. So we take that as a given. What can I add to the rich discussion that you've had already? Well, I will speak briefly about the importance of Africa in the specific context of COP26 and the importance, obviously, of the research and innovation and how that relates to our COP presidency priorities. But first of all, let me say I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a scientist at all. I'm not an academic either. So I am completely out of my comfort zone in the company of this distinguished panel. And I've welcomed very much this glimpse into your world. Let me reciprocate, and give you a sort of glimpse into my world as well. And what is the political context in which we are preparing now for COP26, and particularly the UK political context? Let me start with a couple of quotations and see whether you can identify who may have said these things. And I'll give you a clue, they're recent and they're living still. First one, unless we get global emissions under control within a decade, many parts of the world face an apocalyptic future. This is the most critical point in our lifetime. Ooh, you could probably guess any number of people, but I'll say for you, it is Mr. Alok Sharma, who is, on behalf of 197 states parties, the incoming COP president designate. And he said that just yesterday in a Financial Times op-ed, which I commend to you. I mean, this is not saying, this is talking about apocalypse, and it's talking about the most critical point in our lifetime. Another quotation, see if you can guess this one. In 2021 and beyond, this government will make tackling climate change and biodiversity loss its number one priority. Full stop. Well, that's Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the foreword to the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy, published on the 16th of March. Again, a very bold statement. No ifs, no buts, no caveats. This is the number one government priority, 2021 and beyond. So I think it is important for us to take on board both the magnitude of the climate challenge, but also how far the UK and many other governments have come in understanding and beginning to respond to it. COP26 in November is the immediate focus, and it is an event to force the necessary progress for the planet. My job is simple. My job is to improve chances of success at COP26 by ensuring the needs and priorities of Africa are addressed. Without African needs being addressed, COP26 will not succeed. Now, I speak as the COP26 presidency incoming, where we are operating not on behalf of the UK, we are operating on behalf of 196 countries plus the European Union, so 197 states parties to the climate conventions. So why will we not succeed if Africa's priorities are not addressed? Well, Ambassador Seyni Afo has very well explained in his opening remarks some of this. I say there are three reasons. First, very simply, tactically, this climate change convention, the UNFCCC process operates by consensus. That means any one of the 197 can stop an agreement. And the African group of negotiators, as Ambassador Afo pointed out, represents 54 very well organized, very well informed, and very influential countries who operate as a negotiating bloc. So tactically, we have to have them absolutely on board for Glasgow. Second reason, morally, ethically, and also the COP president designate Alex Sharma does not shy away from saying in his Financial Times op-ed this week that the rich developed world has a moral obligation to help those most impacted by and least responsible for climate change. And any number of figures we can choose illustrate the scale of the challenge posed by poverty, climate, and now COVID in Africa. It's been mentioned already, but I mean, it is staggering, and we need to absolutely take it on board. The latest IMF figures just a few days ago, 30 million extra people will be put into extreme poverty in Africa as a result of the COVID crisis, 30 million. And similar number of jobs estimated to be lost, according to the ILO. Most countries will lose an average of 3% of GDP, according to the IMF. So climate change in itself is going to affect Africa, according to the UNECA report I read recently. If we can keep the world to a 2-degree temperature rise, that will still lead to a 5% cut in GDP across Africa, if we can keep to 2%. In the worst case climate change scenario, according to the IPCC, rice production in Africa will fall by 12% by 2050, and wheat 21%. And that's at a time when Africa will have more mouths to feed and more people to be employed. 2.5 billion people by 2050. That's an additional 1.1 billion compared to today. And so, you know, the moral imperative, if you like, is very clear. The third reason we have to put Africa's interests center stage in Glasgow is also self-interest. It's not an argument that appeals much to me, but for some it is important. Impacts of climate change in Africa will have impacts on all of us in developed and rich countries. If Africa cannot adapt and be resilient, we shall see emissions increase from Africa either by deforestation or industrialization, and net zero will not be achievable by the world. So, not to mention the loss of biodiversity, migration, and exacerbation of conflict as well. So it's in our self-interest. What does success look like at COP26? What are we striving for as presidency on behalf of 196 other states parties? Well, everyone will define success differently. But Alex Sharma for the presidency has set 4 clear goals for us, and all of them are about increasing ambition. Increasing ambition in terms of reducing emissions. As we know, the current NDCs will reduce emissions by less than 1% of what is needed to reach 1.5 degrees. So 1% of the 29 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions are counted for by current NDCs. So we have to do better. The UK has just today published or announced that it will publish its 6th carbon budget, which has a target, very, very high target, improving on our existing NDC. So we hope of setting a pace on that. Adaptation and resilience is the second goal, to raise ambition on that. That means more priority to adaptation, more money for adaptation, more local adaptation, and adaptation communications from all parties to the climate change conventions before COP26 would help. Third, finance. 100 billion at least has to be clearly there and achieved in terms of firm commitments by Glasgow. But it's also not just public money. We have to increase private sector. We have to increase the greening of other funding from, for example, the special drawing rights recently announced. And then the fourth goal is collaboration. More collaboration, enhanced ambition for collaboration. That includes settling some of the issues which Ambassador Afro mentioned, which is the Paris rulebook, completing that, Article 6, common timeframes, transparency. But most of all, it is a spirit of collaboration and cooperation that we need. And arguably, this is the most important because the planet needs a collective effort. Governments, businesses, civil society, academics, yourselves, scientists, indigenous groups, youth, all need to come together. And this is why today, Alok Sharma, the COP president designate, is crisscrossing the globe as we speak. He's on his way back from Japan. He's been to India, South Korea, Nepal, Costa Rica. But where did he start all his traveling this year in this capacity? It was in Africa. And he visited 5 African countries in the space of 10 weeks: Ethiopia, Gabon, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, Africa, center and front. So a comprehensive effort is needed because everything is linked: economics, politics, security. In fact, it adds up to a complete sustainable development agenda to which everyone needs to contribute. We've discussed, and Rosalind West, my colleague from the FCGO, has spoken clearly about the UK's commitment to innovation and research. And so I won't repeat what she said about our nature and adaptation and resilience campaigns, where we have the Adaptation Research Alliance and also the Transforming Agricultural Innovation for People, Nature and Climate campaign. These are really important efforts, and I'm proud that we are doing these as part of our effort to achieve a successful COP26. We need research and innovation to deliver practical solutions, as has been noted, which can help poor farmers adapt to climate change and protect nature and biodiversity. Through our COP26 and our G7 presidencies, and we should mention COP26, we are also in partnership with Italy, who also are presidency of the G20. So it's a very important, powerful combination. Through these presidencies this year, we will continue to advance leadership on research and innovation and drive a sustainable transformation in Africa, we hope. We hope that in the lead up to the COP, you will all continue to work with us to transform agricultural innovation systems and by pledging and contributing towards sustainable change. Let me just conclude by making two. When I wrote my speech, or my notes for this speech, I said I would make 2 personal suggestions or recommendations, but they're redundant. Having listened to the panel, everybody is already saying the same thing. So I would just like to make two comments along the same lines and to applaud the fact that you have mentioned them. I mean, Barbara Evans set it out in her opening remarks with brilliant examples, and also Tembi, Mwamakamba, and Rosalind Parker. You've all said the same. But first, I would underline the importance of good communication by scientists and academics, clear presentation of data in a way that means something to your audiences and in a way which helps and stimulates citizens to make the case for climate action by their leaders. And leaders in many countries, but particularly in Africa, we have to recognize climate change is not the #1 priority on most of their agendas. They have economic poverty needs, they have conflict and security needs. So demanding climate action by people, of their leaders, stimulated by clear science and research and communication. This means that projects and research should demonstrate benefits in terms of jobs, improved livelihoods, human and political security. So secondly, I was going to recommend, it's redundant as well, and Doug Parker most clearly highlighted it, that keep on backing and supporting African-owned and African-led initiatives in science and innovation. The expertise is there, the drive and creativity are there. And at the political level, I would say the UK is supporting, for example, the African Union's own Green Recovery Action Plan and its 5 priorities, which are climate finance, renewable energy, nature-based solutions, resilient agriculture, and green and resilient cities. And I know there is a rich amount of scientific and academic cooperation which is underway, and that is great. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me this afternoon. Thank you for your contribution to striving for success in Glasgow. COP26 is, as final quotation, John Kerry has said, the world's last best chance. So in November, it is a time for us all to come, #together for our planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sir Kay, for these very insightful remarks. You may not be a scientist, as you apologetically pointed out at the beginning of your speech, but obviously you speak from a very knowledgeable position. And I would like to thank you for all the work you are doing in making COP26 a success. And particularly appreciate the point that you underlined of the importance of prioritizing African interests at the conference, which I think is a very important point to underline. At the end of this session, I would have liked to invite all the panelists to emphasize one thing that they would like COP26 to deliver to get us from research to innovation. Now, we don't have time to receive your responses to that question right now because we need to close this session. But if you are on Twitter, panelists, may I invite you to tweet your response to that question. And may I invite people in the audience to also make their wish for COP26 and their ideas for the conference and post these on Twitter so that we build on the energy, on the ideas, on the commitments that we have been sharing in the conversation this afternoon, and that we can capitalize on that as we prepare for COP26. Please do check out other events taking place at the University of Leeds this week under the theme Connecting Voices for Climate Action. If you Google University of Leeds Connecting Voices for Climate Action, you will find a program of activities this week. And there will be opportunities later this week to continue the kind of conversations that we have begun today. In the year prior to COP26, the UK is having a year of climate action under the theme Together for our planet. This theme conveys that we cannot afford to wait to act against the threat of climate change. I hope that today's discussion has given you food for thought, as well as munition for action. We must work together to protect our planet and people and to ensure a greener, more resilient future for us all. So let's make use of the ideas, of the energy that we have been sharing today, not just as we prepare for COP26, but in the journey that follows after the conference, as we work for a better world for all of us. Thank you.